Hi ladies and gents. Tonight we wander somewhere older than time and softer than dreams, to a place where sandals slap stone floors, candles flicker low, and the only real drama is whether Brother Oswin remembered to feed the scriptorium cat. Press that subscribe button before your eyelids press themselves. Now, close your eyes and loosen your toga, mentally speaking of course, as we drift back to a place filled with gossip, grapes, and entirely too many reclining couches. Welcome to ancient Rome, where dinner was a full-body workout and questions like who brought the honeyed dormice were considered both polite and spiritually profound. Contrary to how modern television imagines it, not every Roman feast ended with orgies and oiled gladiators juggling pomegranates. That sort of thing was more of a Thursday tradition, and typically reserved for emperors with identity crises. The average Roman feast, or convivium if you want to sound classy in Latin, was both less scandalous and somehow stickier. Olive oil was everywhere, on your hands, your robes, and once, reportedly, inside someone's inkpot. Poor poet never recovered. It all started in the atrium, the grand entrance hall. Imagine marble floors echoing with sandal slap, polished bronze mirrors reflecting the flicker of oil lamps, and someone in the corner complaining about how their slaves watered down the wine too much. Again, guests rarely walked into a feast standing. No. The real action happened in the triclinium, a sort of U-shaped arrangement of 3 couches surrounding a low table. Why sit when you can recline dramatically on your left elbow, forever massaging a cramp into your shoulder while trying to look seductive with fig juice on your chin? The food. It came in courses as long and winding as a senator's monologue. Starters might include stuffed dates, cleverly disguised larks' tongues, or the famed fried dormice, rolled in honey and poppy seeds until they resembled something vaguely appetizing if you squinted hard enough and had zero moral reservations. And then came the wine. Romans didn't just drink wine, they marinated in it, philosophically and sometimes literally. A true host prepared a crater, a large mixing bowl where wine was blended with water, because only barbarians drank it straight. Into this bowl went not only wine and water, but sometimes spices, herbs, or even seawater. Yes, seawater. Because why stop at questionable grapes when you can also include the taste of Poseidon's underpants? But here's the thing. It wasn't just about getting delightfully tipsy. Wine, in all its watered-down splendor, was a slippery vehicle for conversation, poetry, and subtly insulting your rivals. Guests might share political gossip, recite Ovid from memory, or challenge each other in improvised verse games, all while wondering if they were sitting on the good side of the couch where the peanuts were. Let's address the elephant in the villa, the alleged wild Roman orgies. Yes, some feasts drifted in that direction once the torches got low and the poetry rhymed a little too well. But these were rare, mostly overly dramatized by later historians, and usually required at least one half-mad emperor, a very forgiving guest list, and someone who owned a marble statue that could be discreetly turned to face the corner. In reality, most dinner parties ended with indigestion, philosophical sighs, and someone loudly declaring they'd invented a new kind of poetry called sad vomit musings. As for intimacy, well, flirtation was plentiful, subtlety optional, and sometimes reduced to someone murmuring, "May I compare your shoulders to the aqueducts?" which sounded better in Latin, allegedly. The entertainment was an entire drama unto itself. Musicians, jugglers, dancers, and, if the host was feeling especially avant-garde, a philosopher who would debate a mime about the nature of virtue. The mime usually won. Even the layout of the couches mattered. The host lay dead center, the place of honor went to one side, and the lowest ranking guest was assigned the spot nearest the wine spillage zone, which means, technically, they were first in line when someone knocked over the crater. A bittersweet privilege. So yes, while Roman feasts sometimes dabbled in debauchery, more often they were a lukewarm mix of intellectual showboating, fermented snacks, and the occasional cucumber tossed in mistaken passion. They were less wild party and more college lecture, where everyone's lying down and possibly slightly poisoned by bad oysters. And as the candles burned lower and the chatter melted into snores, Rome's distinguished elites ended their night in the way all great parties conclude, with awkward goodbyes, misplaced sandals, and 3 poets asleep in the vestibule arguing softly about the moon. Let that image carry you gently into a dream of sandals, laughter, and too many grapes. Sleep well, dream kindly, and remember, never sit too close to the oyster platter. The air in ancient Rome was thick with the hum of ambition, olive oil, and perfume of questionable origin. But if you strolled through the marble streets on any warm summer evening, past garrulous fishmongers, sandal-clad philosophers, and goats who had clearly lost their way, you might catch the sound of laughter, clinking cups, and the occasional theatrical sob echoing from behind a wealthy citizen's atrium doors. Ah yes, the Roman convivium, technically just the word for banquet, but truly, it was dinner, drama, and Dionysus all in one. To understand the peculiar world of Roman feasts, you must first know that dinner wasn't just dinner, it was performance art. Imagine if your average Tuesday night meal were hosted in between haute couture and a toga drag show with a side of gladiator gossip. That's about the vibe. But before anyone could recline on their left elbow like a decadent body pillow, guests had to be ranked. Yes, even at dinner, Rome remained deeply committed to the social ladder. Senators and equestrians might be shown to the plush triclinia, the signature 3-couch arrangement that surrounded the table. Each couch held 3 guests, positioned according to status, importance, or how closely you resembled a bust of Jupiter. If, however, you were merely a freedman, a poet who'd fallen out of favor, or just chronically uninteresting, you were probably stuck near the foot of the room, next to the door and farthest from the wine. Speaking of wine, it flowed generously, but with rules. Oh, the rules. In Roman times, wine was never drunk neat, unless you were a barbarian, or trying to end your day early. It was usually diluted with water, sometimes with honey, herbs, or spices. Ratios varied, with a particularly strong vintage being 4 parts water to 1 part wine. Anything stronger and you risked being labelled a drunkard or a poet, or both. And yes, the Romans had a thing called the symposium, which the Greeks had first. And while the Greeks sipped and mused about love and metaphysics, the Romans were less about metaphysics and more about metaphysical quantities of pork. The courses came out in waves, like edible poetry. First came the gustatio, the appetizer portion, eggs, olives, fancy salads, and garum, the fermented fish sauce that Romans put on absolutely everything. Think of it as ancient ketchup, if ketchup were made of umami and regret. After the gustatio came the prima mensa, the main course, which could include delicacies like roasted dormice stuffed with minced meat and herbs, or peacock tongues if you were trying to impress someone or bankrupt yourself creatively. Of course, dessert. It was called secunda mensa and was usually something simple: fruits, nuts, honey cakes, but more importantly, This was the turning point of the evening. This is when things loosened. Up until this moment, guests might behave with a semblance of civility. Senators passed around compliments and passive aggression like bowls of olives. But once dessert landed and the wine ratio leaned less water-heavy, conversation took on the unpredictable quality of a chariot race during a thunderstorm. This was the dominion of the commissatio, the drinking party within the party. Guests elected a master of the drinks, or arbiter bibendi, whose job was to declare how strong the mixing ratio should be and how often the cups should be refilled. It was an oddly democratic moment in the hierarchy of Roman social climbing. A portly general might be told by a skinny poet that tonight he'd better drink wine like a fish with a mortgage. Games were played. Some involved dice, poetry, or scandalous dares. Others involved impromptu poetry slams, usually deteriorating into saucy limericks about senators one wouldn't dare name in daylight. And yes, occasionally, things took a more sensual turn. Reclining at table meant you were already halfway toward a nap or an indiscretion. Stories survive of orgies, but the word is deeply misunderstood. Not every Roman dinner turned into a soft-focused Bacchic rave. That was reserved for elite circles or particularly adventurous birthdays. More often, it was flirtation, a suggestive toast, perhaps a stolen kiss behind a potted laurel. Titillating mischief before the night curled itself into slumber. All the while, slaves bustled quietly, pouring wine, adjusting cushions, collecting the bones of sacrificial peacocks, as invisible as shadows, yet essential to the whole charade. As the candles dipped low and the lute players leaned into tired chords one by one, guests snored in silk robes or stumbled home, wondering how many grapes one could eat before becoming a philosophical fruit. And so, with bellies full and secrets whispered into amphorae, we drift gently onward to another unusual layer of Roman indulgence, where gods, ghosts, and lavatories shared far more in common than you might imagine. As twilight draped its violet shawl over the 7 hills of Rome, the city began to hum, not with the bustle of the forum or the clang of gladiators' steel, but with the quieter, more luxurious murmurs of invitations. If you were someone with enough coin, clout, or eyebrows to impress a senator, you might just find yourself beckoned to a Roman convivium, a dinner party that was half social event, half strategic chessboard, and sometimes just a full-blown display of decadence, seasoned with roasted dormice. Now, you might be imagining something like a cozy evening with togas and a jug of wine, but I assure you, a Roman feast was much less about sipping Chianti and more about showcasing who had the fanciest gold-gilded pig. These affairs began just after sunset and went on into the smoky hours before dawn, fueled by wine, wit, and just a sprinkle of existential dread. Let's begin with the arrival. Guests didn't exactly show up fashionably late. They were summoned. Invitations were often verbal, delivered by a slave, sometimes with the kind of urgency that suggested showing up 10 minutes late might get you demoted to eating outside with the goats. Upon arrival, guests were greeted by more slaves, perfumed water to rinse their hands, and sometimes musicians playing soft melodies on the cithara, which is essentially a lyre that went to music school. The festive area, often called the triclinium, was the beating heart of sensual Roman luxury. Picture it now. Low couches arranged in a U shape around a central table, embroidered cushions, everything scented faintly with myrrh and over-ambition. Roman citizens didn't sit to eat. They reclined. Yes, imagine holding a bowl of honeyed pears while lying sideways and trying to maintain dignity. That's how you impressed a date in ancient Rome. The seating arrangement was more than just comfort. It was a social leaderboard. The far left, couch, was for VIPs. The middle, for moderately important fish in the senatorial pond. And the lowest spot, near the foot of the table, was for newcomers, poets, and the host's brother-in-law, who couldn't take a hint. The meal officially commenced with eggs. Not a personal preference, but a ritual. The Romans had the charming expression ab ovo usque ad mala, meaning from egg to apples, referring to the standard course of the dinner. Eggs for starters, then mountains of fanciful fish, roasted game birds, exotic meats, possibly a singer or two breaking into odes mid-meal, and finally fruit and nuts to seal the deal. But let's pause for a moment on the dinnerware. This wasn't your average ceramic set. Wealthy Romans used silver, gold, and occasionally, if they were feeling too rich to relate to other humans, drinking vessels made from precious gems. Think of it as drinking wine out of a Fabergé egg, while making eye contact with someone's bored husband. Ah yes, wine. The soul of the feast, and depending on your stamina, your undoing. Roman wine was strong. So strong, in fact, that drinking it undiluted was considered barbaric. Imagine that, ordering a neat wine and being looked at like you just kicked a senator's pet flamingo. Wine was mixed with water, sometimes even with honey, herbs, or the occasional dash of seawater for that extra Mediterranean zing. And it wasn't served like today. Glasses weren't topped off quietly. Instead, the Magister Bibendi, or Master of Drinking, presided, sort of like a sacred frat brother with a ladle. He decided how strong the wine would be and how often it was poured. Too generous, and by midnight, half the guests would be wrestling dogs. Too stingy, and you risked a polite revolt performed via poetry. As the wine flowed, so did the conversation, sometimes deep, philosophical, and winding like a Cicero speech. Other times, a bit more rumour-heavy and slurred. This was where reputations were polished or destroyed. A senator might impress with his latest Stoic musings, while a courtesan might recite Virgil by candlelight with just the right amount of wink. Wit was the currency, and tipsiness the exchange rate. Of course, there was performance too. Dancers, musicians, mimes, and sometimes what can only be described as adult-oriented shadow puppet theatre. The entertainment functioned as a palate cleanser between courses of peacock tongues or eel pie, though frankly, eel pie clears the palate all on its own. The line between feast and frenzy was thin. As the night rolled on, inhibitions peeled away like figs on a silk platter. Some guests whispered sweet nothings to each other over shared dates, while others simply fell asleep on their plates, luxuriating in full bellies, dulled senses, and the soft music of a lyre echoing through a marble atrium. But feasting, as you'll gently discover, was only the first half of the ritual. And as the last grape is plucked and the last joke slurred, the real twilight spectacle begins. It was not uncommon on a languid Roman evening for a household to begin vibrating gently with anticipation around the 5th hour, what we might call early afternoon, or what cats call their 3rd nap. The slaves would start laying out couches, polishing bronze goblets, and making weary mental notes about which dinner guests were likely to require being discreetly carried out before sunrise. You see, a proper Roman feast, the kind that you might be gently snoring through had you lived back then, was less about eating and more about everything that happened around the food, after the food, and occasionally on top of it. This was not simply dinner. This was convivium, a word that means living together, but suspiciously contains the root word for wine. They weren't hiding their priorities. Let us now drift into the atrium of a wealthy Roman's house, where the scent of roasted dormice laced with honey and poppy seeds meanders through pillars of polished marble like a naughty little cloud. Flavored snow, seafood soaked in garum, a fish sauce that smelled like Poseidon's armpit, and figs stuffed with something mysterious and expensive, all of it laid out not so much as a meal, but as a sort of edible social performance. Appetizers in a Roman feast often translated roughly to the things we eat until we can no longer remember what day it is. Of course, reclining was mandatory. Guests lounged on their left elbows along padded couches, a posture that supposedly eased digestion, though mostly just made it harder to escape when the host's terrible poetry began. 3 couches formed a U-shape called a triclinium, a term that sounds very scholarly, but essentially describes furniture arranged to encourage shared inebriation. Now, Roman drinking culture was elaborate, ritualized, and deeply committed to pretending it wasn't slowly turning everyone's liver into a pumice stone. The wine itself was never guzzled straight, as that was considered both vulgar and a bit barbarian. The nobles mixed their wine with water, herbs, and in particularly awful recipes, seawater. Yes, seawater. Ancient sommeliers would swirl the amphora and say things like, "Ah, a fine vintage with notes of Mediterranean brine and subtle regret." And here enters our friend, the Magister Bibendi, the master of drinking. This lucky or cursed individual was selected to guide the evening's alcohol pace, essentially functioning as a party DJ with wine ladles. It was his solemn duty to decide the wine-to-water ratio, raise the first toast, and maintain the delicate social balance between elegantly tipsy philosopher and guy stuck in a potted plant yelling about Jupiter. The rules for these gatherings were fuzzy, but mostly adhered to one golden principle. The more you drank, the more philosophical you became. Or at least, you believed you were. One might find themselves pontificating at length about Stoic ethics, while simultaneously trying to fish an olive out of their sandals. Now, the Romans didn't drink wine during meals. Oh no, that would have been dreadfully un-Greek. The real drinking began after the food in the commissatio, which roughly translates to that time of day your toga starts falling off. And while yes, entertainment might include music, poetry readings, juggling dwarves, or flamingo tongue quizzes, the real amusements had to be whispered about. Less out of shame, more for the fun of it. Let us gently pull the linen curtain for a moment and peek, just peek, into the more private corners of these feasts. Certain guests might find themselves invited towards secluded chambers, where oil lamps flickered with an almost mischievous rhythm. And there, perhaps, with a musician playing something haunting on a lyre and a body slave discreetly refreshing one's garland, guests could explore pleasures not listed on the official menu. After all, the Roman elite wore morality like a seasonal cloak, donned in public, shed at home. It wasn't always orgiastic madness. Often, it was quieter, softer. A curl of flute music, fingers stained with figs and honey, laughter echoing into moonlight while the city rustled outside. But yes, sometimes things did escalate into scenes more befitting a particularly risque villa in Pompeii. Historians debate the frequency of these debaucheries. The truth, the Romans, like people today, mostly exaggerated their wild stories for fun, except they did it on mosaic floors with captions like, "This was a Tuesday." And as the wine amphorae emptied into hungrier mouths and the candles dipped lower in their bronze helmets, even the boldest senators and most marble-headed philosophers began to retreat into dream-soaked silence. Someone, always, would fall asleep in the fountain. But what about the entertainment beyond food and flirtations? The raucous performances, masks, and mischief that danced just outside the candle's reach? Ah, yes. Let's let the music swell just a little longer and wander cautiously toward that glow. Ah, the Roman banquet, where a goblet of wine was never too far from one's hand, and neither was a poet, a gladiator, or the occasional stray monkey trained to juggle figs. By now, we've stepped over the marble threshold of the Roman convivium, the fancy term for party where people pretend to lie down and eat grapes. But tonight, we turn our soft focus to the peculiar creatures who kept these feasts flowing. Not the senators in togas or the guests reclining at odd personal angles. No, we're talking about the staff, the silent ballet of servers, musicians and servants who kept the roast peacock warm and the wine flowing thicker than the Tiber in flood season. At the heart of every successful Roman dinner was a lectus, a cushioned lounging couch on which guests reclined sideways in what can only be described as medieval yoga poses. Yes, they dined on one elbow, because forks hadn't been invented, dignity be darned, and nobody had yet said, "Let's just use chairs, Marcus." But beneath the indolent murmurs and the tinkle of lyres, servants scurried like tuxedoed shadows. They weren't just filling cups. They were practically choreographing social etiquette. One wrong refill, one splash of wine in the wrong lap, and the host might be publicly ridiculed in bad poetry for years. And yes, that was a genuine Roman fear. Now, Roman parties had a particular order. There was the gustaccio, or starter, a salad of olives, dormice, if you were posh, and perhaps some honey-glazed sow's udder. Yes, really. Just imagine that moment when your dinner host lifts a silver lid with a grand flourish and proudly reveals a crispy pig nipple. Etiquette demanded you react with mild delight, not terror. Following the starters came the prima mensa, the main course, which might include whole fish dressed like emperors, or exotic birds plucked and reassembled by cooks who moonlit as taxidermists. These dishes arrived on platters the size of ox carts, carried with gymnastic poise by young slaves trained to navigate crowds without spilling a single lark tongue. And then there was the commissaccio, the after-party of ancient banquets. This was the part where decorum took a brief leave of absence, often with its clothes inside out. Here, we would find our well-plied senators slurring about poetry, politics, and love tales that grew ever more elaborate with each goblet. It was less deep conversation and more plastered monologue. The designated master of drinking, yes, that was an actual title, Magister Bibendi, would decree how strong the wine should be diluted. Romans never drank wine straight. They watered it down like responsible hedonists and then added things like honey, herbs, or, for the truly adventurous, roasted oyster shells. Think of it as ancient Alka-Seltzer with consequences. The servants managing this bacchanal tornado often had multitasking skills that would make modern baristas weep. Holding a jug, scooping wine, guarding the fig tray, and timing belly dancers. All while being invisible. Some hosts were so rich, or let's say, insecure, that they trained their servants to remain silent, to appear ethereal. Whisper efficiency with no clanking. A flaw of ghosts with excellent hand-eye coordination. Let us not forget the musicians. Harps, panpipes, flutes, and sometimes just long, dramatic pauses. Music floated through the air like a sleepy incense, never loud enough to drown out gossip, but sensual enough to lull a scribe into spilling state secrets while cradling a bowl of honeyed dates. But not every party had pure intentions. Some feasts were strategic traps, designed to extract secrets or forge alliances with wine-lubricated flattery. There's even a tale of a senator who swore on the gods that he'd never share military secrets, and then whispered them mid-hiccup to a platter of apricots, not realizing the platter was being closely monitored by Rome's gossip elite. By moonlight, when the oil lamps flickered and the last nibble of boar's cheek disappeared into someone's toga fold, the convivium mellowed into a gentle murmur. Guests drifted into digestible silence, sipping mulled wine brewed with lavender and bay leaf, a surprisingly fragrant end to what began as a display of power, wealth, and how many oysters a man could eat without perishing. And as the lyre gave its final sigh and the last servant extinguished the candles with a trained puff, the feast faded into velvet stillness. The marble floors cooled beneath leopard print rugs. The empty goblets stood like tiny amphorae waiting for morning, and an empire, for a moment, slept beneath its wine-sweet dreams. In the flickering shadows of the triclinium, secrets lingered like perfume, waiting for one more story to quietly slip from the lips of Rome's finest liars. In the gentle hush that follows a feast, now, contrary to modern assumptions, and perhaps the more optimistic imaginations of toga-clad college parties, not every Roman feast descended into bacchanalian oblivion by the second course. Sure, there were wild, wine-drenched nights of merriment and mischief, but even the Romans had their etiquette. Welcome to the convivium, the Roman dinner party. Not quite a Victorian tea, but not always a Dionysian free-for-all either. A proper Roman host arranged his guest list with meticulous care, guided partly by who could offer stimulating conversation, and partly by who wouldn't vomit on the mosaic floor. You see, Rome prized oratory, so if you were the sort who could gracefully argue both poetry and politics between spoonfuls of oysters, congratulations. You were on the guest list. If you tended to confuse Cicero with cilantro, perhaps not. Still, there's always room for colourful characters, especially those who brought their own entertainment, musicians, dancers, or that one friend who could recite all of Virgil backwards. Feasting began only after the proper phase, the gustaccio. Consider it an ancient appetizer lineup: eggs, olives, lightly spiced vegetables. It was the Roman way of saying, prepare thy stomach, things are about to escalate dramatically. And escalate they did. Meals could stretch for hours, with the triclinium, the famed three-couch dining arrangement, at the centre of it all. Guests reclined on their left elbow, leaving the right hand free for nibbling, gesturing, or one-upping fellow diners with tales of scandal from the forum. Wine, naturally, flowed like a well-fed aqueduct. But, and this is important, Roman wine was always diluted. Drinking it straight was what barbarians did, or college freshmen. The water-to-wine ratio varied depending on how civil or spicy the night was to become. A 4.1 water-to-wine mix signalled polite diplomacy. A 1.1 mix meant someone had brought their ex, and things might get interesting. The symposiarch, the host, or sometimes an elected wine master, determined the evening's potency. It was a role of considerable power. This person wielded the wine ladle like Zeus held lightning, bestowing mirth or madness with each refill. Now, topics of dinner conversation ranged from gripping philosophical debates. Is virtue learned or innate? To more pressing matters like, Do we think that marble bust of my uncle looks a bit like a goat? Laughter and wit were cherished. A good pun could win applause. A bad one could still earn a refill depending on the company. And then came the entertainments. No TV, remember. So the options were various live renditions of myths, often rated mature, musical interludes, dancers, sometimes clothed, more often not, or acrobats who could balance amphorae on the tips of their toes while dodging grapes hurled in jest. In the more refined households, a philosopher might be invited to give a short lecture. Picture a man in sandals standing among robed elites, explaining stoicism, while a slightly tipsy patrician to his left adjusts his laurel wreath and murmurs, "This is extremely profound," between hiccups. Of course, class still mattered. Not all Romans feasted in opulent villas nestled along the Palatine Hill. Lower-class citizens or plebeians had their own gatherings, more modest, but no less merry. Imagine homemade garum-slathered fish, cups of passably passable wine, and laughter echoing through cramped courtyards. Cruder jokes, heartier songs, and the ever-present neighbour who insisted on performing a dramatic monologue from Plautus to anyone who would listen, or couldn't escape. And we mustn't forget the role of the spintriae, those tokens used in more risque parts of certain elite feasts, sometimes exchanged like playing cards mixed with pickup lines. Their exact use is debated. Possibly just novelty items, or perhaps the world's earliest loyalty cards for brothel escapes. As to when the banquet ended, it rarely did by schedule. Some drifted off to guest rooms. Others stumbled into fountains, exchanging philosophical thoughts with shrubbery. The staff, who had spent hours carrying platters and sponging absent-minded spills, finally sighed and began setting things back in order until the next feast. So yes, Roman dinner parties could be debauched, but also delightfully constructed performances where food, conversation, and spectacle flowed together like a well-aged Falernian. A place where Cicero might clash with Catullus over olives, and philosophy swirled in the air like the smoke from frankincense braziers. But what of the wine itself? Was it good or merely abundant? Turn your ear, and we shall uncork that mystery next. If the Roman Empire had a talent for anything, and let's be honest, they did have a few, it was elevating leisure to an almost sacred art, and nestled squarely at the plush, wine-drenched heart of Roman downtime. The triclinia. Oh yes, these weren't just dining rooms. These were velvet-draped temples to indulgence, where social climbing was best done horizontally. On a couch, with grapes in one hand and a suspicious-looking seafood custard in the other. A triclinia, a fancy word borrowed from the Greeks, because everything about Roman high-class life was essentially a Greek cosplay, was typically a room with 3 couches arranged around a low table. Guests reclined on their left elbows, legs artfully splayed, leaving their right hands free for the important work of pomegranate nibbling, wine swirling, and occasionally catching rogue olives that had bounced off a platter with the aerodynamic integrity of a catapulted pebble. Now, in common fairness, we must clarify. Not every Roman had access to opulent feasts. Contrary to modern portrayals, not every citizen of Rome dined like Dionysus on a bender. Most plebeians, that dependable backbone of the empire, ate more modest fare: beans, porridge, the occasional sprinkle of garum if they were feeling wild. But we're not here to pore over porridge. We're here for the aristocrats, the lounge masters themselves. You see, Roman feasting wasn't just about eating. It was a performance, a social chessboard. Seating and invitation order weren't casual. No. You didn't just lie next to Uncle Gaius and Aunt Vibia like it was a backyard wedding. The position assigned to you on the couch triangle revealed your social standing more intimately than your togas ever could. The highest place of honor, the lectus medius, middle couch, center seat. If you found yourself there, congratulations. You were either very important or spectacularly good at flattery. And what of the food itself? Surely culinary transcendence matched the elaborate social scaffolding. Well, yes and no. Let us linger on a popular dish, stuffed dormice. Yes, dormice. The kind that might scurry under your sink today. Only these were lovingly raised in special ceramic jars with built-in exercise wheels. Luxury rodents. They'd be fattened, seasoned with wild herbs, sometimes dipped in honey and poppy seeds, and gently roasted. It was said that the richer the Roman, the more elaborate the dormouse. There were likely senators who could only sleep at night knowing their appetizer had its own fitness routine before reaching the plate. And then there was gustum, the appetizer course, a parade of tongue teasers like pickled sow's udder, boiled ostrich eggs, and shellfish dressed in fermented fish sauce, or garum, Rome's mildly horrifying answer to ketchup. It was essentially the liquid soul of over-salted fish organs, left to ferment in amphorae under the Mediterranean sun, until it achieved a scent that could politely be described as bold, or, if we're honest, apocalyptic. The Romans adored it. Needless to say, wine flowed far more readily than water. In fact, water was considered suspect, and not unreasonably, considering Roman plumbing systems sometimes involved lead piping like it was going out of style. Wine, though. Wine was the universal solvent. It lubricated conversation, blurred social lines, and excused just about every political conspiracy ever conceived while sprawling on a velvet cushion. But Roman wine was not sipped so much as engineered. It was rarely drunk pure. That would have been considered utterly uncivilized, a good way to get blacklisted from future parties, or accidentally declared an enemy of the state. Instead, wine was mixed with water, sometimes seawater for that coastal tang, or flavored with herbs, spices, and yes, even bits of resin from pine trees, because apparently, when you've run out of traditional garnishes, the next logical step is to drink Christmas. And with that alcohol-infused grace, conversation would flow. Speeches were made, debates bubbled, poems recited, sometimes sober, often not. The evenings danced between philosophy and flirtation, with moments when even the toga seemed optional, though we'll drift past such scenes respectfully, as your duvet adjusts itself for you. By the time dessert arrived, honey cake, candied fruit, perhaps nuts stuffed with raisins and wrapped in fig leaves, it had less to do with appetite and more to do with ceremony. A soft ending, a sweet sigh, a whispered lullaby to close the senses. Outside, moonlight turned Rome's marble facades to ivory. Inside, the final goblets were tipped, not drained, mind you. That last sip was often left behind as a tiny offering to the household gods. Even in decadence, tradition had its seat at the table. And now, as the final harp string echoes through time and the last crumb of overly elaborate dormouse has vanished, let's gently recline ourselves. Because what came next in the Roman feast was not food nor wine, but entertainment. And it wasn't always what you'd expect. At just about the time the sun dipped behind the Aventine Hill, painting Rome in a haze of peachy pink and the faint smell of goat, the real party preparations began, not among senators or philosophers, but among the people who made celebrating truly possible. The slaves, the cooks, the musicians, and the ever-present wine mixers. Yes, wine mixers. because unlike your cousin Kyle at a backyard barbecue, the Romans never drank their wine straight. That was considered barbaric, truly uncivilized. A bit like ordering chicken nuggets at a Michelin-starred restaurant. Instead, they would mix wine with water, honey, herbs, or, depending on the vibe, resin, salt water, or crushed flowers. It was less about flavor and more of a delicate balancing act between delight and dignity. Too strong, and suddenly you're Nero setting fire to fiddle. Too weak, and what's even the point? Enter the Merum dilemma. Merum was pure, undiluted wine, and drinking it was seen as dangerously decadent. It made you bold, reckless, perhaps even interesting at poetry readings. But for most Roman hosts, the sweet spot of revelry hovered safely between a 3-to-1 water-to-wine ratio and whatever got Cicero talkative, but not tearful. Now, while those all-important earthenware jugs of mixed wine were prepared in the cratera, a large ornamental bowl resembling a very ambitious salad dish, a quiet sort of pre-debauchery buzz, would settle over the dining hall. Cushions fluffed, grapes glistened, and somewhere, probably in a corner, an over-enthusiastic philosopher rehearsed a witty toast about moderation. But let us pause, just for a soft second, and lower our gaze to the guest list. A Roman feast wasn't merely about food and flirtation. It was a reflection of hierarchy, politics, and who had recently offended the host's aunt. Seating was everything. The triclinia, a gracefully arranged trio of couches orbiting the low dining table, hosted guests in precise order. The most esteemed reclined on the central couch, with lesser mortals arranged accordingly. One didn't simply grab a seat. No, it was a delicate ballet of social assassination masked as hospitality. Rich Roman hosts adored seating guests who despised one another side by side. Imagine dining cheek to bearded cheek with your mortal enemy, gently arguing over whether pickled dormice or spiced figs should be passed next. It added spice and tension, and occasionally, very dramatic monologues over garum. Speaking of garum, oh dear listener, if scent were sound, garum would be a cymbal crash made entirely of sardines. This fermented fish sauce, made from the surviving hopes of mackerel and possibly despair, was poured liberally over nearly everything. You know, to give it that je ne sais poisson quality. Beloved by all classes and pungent enough to be detected in Britain centuries after the empire collapsed, garum proves perhaps that humanity's greatest strength is our ability to pretend something smells delicious if everyone else is doing it. Now, one could argue the real heartbeat of the party came from the Orlites, the flute player, or, as many guests might have remembered them several goblets in, that lovely blur-making snake music. The flute wasn't just background ambience, it was part of the atmosphere, hypnotic, pulsing, and vaguely suggestive, much like the state of the average toga after the third course. And as wine warmed bellies and Latin witticisms flew like well-aimed olives, conversations dared to drift into philosophy, poetry, and renovations of public latrines. The famed game of symposia sophistication had begun. Who could quote Virgil the fastest? Who could connect the new aqueduct to the ideals of Stoicism? Who could laugh last when the host's cousin attempted erotic mime? But amidst the intoxicated laughter and the daring glances cast across candlelit cushions, one rule held fast: never outshine the host. Roman etiquette, for all its layers, placed great importance on balance between pleasure and propriety, celebration and seduction, and above all, between chaos and control. The host, reclining like a proud sea lion on imported baboon fur, often bore the entire emotional architecture of the evening on his oiled shoulders. He set the tone, cued the musicians, and was carefully oblivious when two guests began whispering too close for comfort near the fig platter. Control, yes, but not too much. After all, the idea wasn't to avoid scandal. It was to manage it artfully. And so, as torches flickered and shadows danced on marbled columns, the hour crept gently forward, like a toga being tugged by time itself. The feast, still in its ascending arc, chattered with potential. Stories unfurled, senses softened, and somewhere between a mouthful of honey-roasted everything and a not-so-accidental foot graze, the night whispered that something still grander lay ahead. As the Roman sun dipped each evening behind the Palatine Hill, it signaled something far more thrilling than the bedtime. It was party o'clock in the empire's beating heart. With the clink of terracotta cups and the rustle of silk tunics, the Romans gathered, as they often did when bored, wealthy, and in need of a distraction from, say, plague or politics. At the center of it all was the convivium, the Roman banquet, not merely a meal, but an orchestrated performance of indulgence, conversation, and quite often mild to moderate debauchery. But before we set the mood with incense and oil lamps, let's talk seating. The Romans didn't sit the way we might at a dinner table. Oh no, they reclined, always to the left, which was supposedly better for digestion, and perhaps more importantly, for striking a languid philosophical pose while sipping watered-down wine. Picture a sort of indoor chaise lounge situation, known as the triclinium, a U-shaped arrangement of couches around a low table. The number of diners mattered deeply. Roman etiquette books, yes, those existed, cautioned against inviting either too few or too many guests. 3 was too intimate. 10, a circus. 9. 9 was considered ideal. Enough for varied conversation, but not so many that you were stuck next to Gaius the mouth breather all evening. Hosts were expected to provide more than just food and wine. A good host also furnished witty banter, interpretive poetry readings, and sometimes, if the budget allowed, a small ensemble of flute girls. Think of it as ancient Spotify, played live, and with a solid emphasis on breath control. Now, if we lean a bit closer to the table, past the stewed dormice and honey-glazed figs, we'll catch a glimpse of another important aspect of the evening: the wine. Roman wine was famously strong, so strong in fact that to drink it unwatered was considered barbaric, or, at the very least, extremely optimistic. A respectful ratio was around 1 part wine to 3 parts water. Anything stronger, and you might earn the nickname Bacchant, which is a fancy title for someone who loses their toga before dessert. Despite our modern image of Romans as relentless drinkers, they were surprisingly structured about their intoxication. There was even a toastmaster, like a buzz monitor, who decided the pace and strength of each round of wine. Bacchus, help you if you drank too quickly. Social faux pas, indeed. And here's where things get interesting, or sleepily scandalous. After the meal, once everyone had praised the sauces and belittled the fish bones, the symposium, a sort of after-party, began. What started as a discussion of Stoic philosophy could quickly slide into awkward poetry recitations, flute duets, and that signature Roman institution, the game of kottabos. Kottabos, a delightful and nearly impossible drinking game in which tipsy participants flung the dregs of their wine at a target, often while reclining and expounding on the nature of the virtuous republic. The game required coordination, elegance, and, given the frequency of stains on mosaic floors, perhaps a touch of divine intervention. But not all banquets were frivolous fun. Some served political purposes, carefully curated to build alliances, curry favor, or eavesdrop with style. The seating plan itself was often a work of Machiavellian art. To be placed nearest the host meant prestige, while ending up at the far end of the couch roll might suggest you'd made some recent policy blunders, or worse, brought subpar olives. Now, if you're wondering whether these feasts truly descended into the wild, toga-shedding escapades of modern imaginings, well, occasionally they did. There were certainly elite parties legendary enough to make even modern influencers blush. Emperors like Nero and Caligula seemed intent on testing the limits of both their stomachs and their reputations. Lavish fountains of wine, edible gold leaf, and guests who occasionally exited through the garden fountain were not entirely unheard of. But for your average Roman patrician, a banquet was about status, storytelling, and slowly unwinding under the warm candle glow of an oil lamp. Gossip drifted like perfume. Servants topped off cups. Someone inevitably misquoted Virgil. And outside, the crickets began their nightly chorus, indifferent to the political squabbles and rotisserie flamingo within. Which takes us very gently, like a breeze through the colonnades, to another whispered aspect of these gatherings, those private chambers adjoining the feast where the real secret slept. But let's leave that for another evening, when the lamps are dimmer and the wine has gone to our heads. Imagine, if you will, the soft golden flicker of oil lamps dancing along the walls of a Roman triclinium, one of those classic banquet rooms where dignitaries and disreputables alike recline three to a couch, elbow deep in grapes and scandal. The air is scented with crushed herbs, mingled somewhat courageously with the distant hint of goat. Lying on their left sides, feet away from the food, thank the gods, diners murmured poetry, swapped gossip, and questioned the painter's decisions on who got draped and who didn't. We find ourselves in the second act of a rather boisterous convivium, the Latin word for feast, though it might just as easily be translated as long journey into the heart of wine. By now, the socially required part of the evening, the ritual sacrifice, political small talk, praising the host's horrible lyre playing, is done. Now the real entertainment begins, symposium, the drinking portion. Yes, for the Romans, meals were a warm-up for more liquid adventures. But don't let the clinking of cups and increasingly off-key singing fool you. It was an art form, chaotically curated. Wine didn't just arrive like an afterthought to hold your cup while you gossiped. No, wine was philosophy in liquid form, or at least a liquid excuse to loudly discuss philosophy, possibly while wearing a laurel wreath and forgetfully petting the nearest statue. But moderation existed, theoretically. At the start of a feast, a magister bibendi, or master of drinking, was chosen, effectively the party's referee, DJ, and moral compass, though one who may or may not have been sober enough to function. This person decided how strong the wine should be, how many toasts were appropriate, and whether dancing naked on the mosaic floor was festive or frowned upon. Roman wine, by the way, wasn't quite like today's cheeky Cabernets. It was stronger, gritty, and usually cut with water to avoid immediate memory loss. Sometimes honey, spices, even seawater were added. A culinary decision that proved Rome's true imperial bravery. There was mulsum, wine sweetened with honey, and conditum, wine that had travelled the spice route back with dreams of India and a good cinnamon aftertaste. And then there was the laura, made by soaking used grape skins, twigs, and seeds in water and fermenting it again. This was the budget option, the box wine of ancient Rome, usually relegated to slaves, dishevelled poets, and anyone who insisted fish sauce was a breakfast condiment. But enough about bouquets and alcohol content. Let's talk about what that wine whispered into the ears of ancient Romans. As the cups emptied and standards drifted like leaves on the Tiber, the after-dinner games kicked in. There was commissatio, late-night singing, culminating in either philosophical enlightenment or a synchronized hiccuping choir. Party guests, having swapped togas for less, conservative ensembles, might engage in competitive poem recitations, improvisational theatre, or guessing how many dates the host could fit into his tunic. Then, for the bold, and possibly legally dubious, came ludus talarius. This was essentially drunken truth or dare, played with tiles or dice, often descending into dares that would alarm even the most seasoned toga wearer. Smooches were traded like currency, alliances secretly formed, and reputations gently frayed. But lest you think it all devolved into mascara-streaked bacchanalia, dusted with antique glitter. Well, sometimes it did. But other times, guests debated stoic ethics between bites of fig-stuffed dormouse, or quietly watched a dancer from Syria spin in torchlight, her bracelets echoing like distant bells. Even here, amid abandoned sandals and spilled pomegranate seeds, religion had a seat at the table. Many feasts toasted the gods, Bacchus especially, because frankly, he was the only one truly pulling his weight at such gatherings. His spirit hovered somewhere between grace and hangover, blessing the night with seductive chaos and the morning with gentle scolding. Now the oil lamps flicker lower. The Magister Bibendi has fallen asleep in a decorative urn. Someone's passed out across the harpist. Outside, the moon silvers the rooftops, and not a single senator recalls where he left his shoes. As the soft hush of sleep begins slipping over the city like a woolen cloak, you may find yourself wondering, what happened when the sun returned, and the traders, teachers, and toga-clad reprobates had to rejoin polite society? That, dear dreamer, is a tale for tender morning light, or another slow drift into the past. As the lamps flickered low over reclining couches and the last course of dormice stuffed with nuts had been carried away, the Roman convivium, the great social feast, subtly shifted into its next phase, the part that polite Roman writers tiptoed around with euphemism and vague poetry. You see, the Romans were a complex bunch, rigid in some ways, reckless in others. And nowhere was that spectrum more on display than in what happened after the wine had been flowing for, far too long. To understand what came next, let's slip into the caligay, or should we say slippers, of a Roman elite by the name of Sextus. Yes, many Romans were unfortunately named. Sextus Valerius Aquilinus, a man known more for his golden goblets than his golden insight, would host evening feasts that started in rhetoric and ended in risque riddles. His home, like most senatorial townhouses, featured a triclinium, dining room, with elaborately tiled floors, frescoes of half-draped deities, and couches meant more for sprawling than sitting. At first, everything was stiff upper lip respectable. Recitations of Virgil, nods to Cicero, and reflections on Jupiter's favour. But by the third cup of wine, what the Greeks called the truthful cup, and the Romans simply called Tuesday, guests started tossing around more than literary quotes. Now here's the thing about Roman feasting episodes. They were rituals of controlled chaos. Organisers like Sextus would draw on the tradition of the symposium, a Greek inheritance, but swirl in an extra dose of theatrical mischief. The boundaries blurred, especially when the lamps burned dim and the heavy dishes had done their work. Indeed, Roman parties developed their own strange etiquette. After dinner was technically when the real party began. This next course wasn't served on a platter, and it certainly wasn't approved by the Senate. Musicians returned, but now they played looser, flirtier tunes, soft lyres and suggestive flute melodies, accompanied by professional dancers who circled like silk-draped shadows. Some were mimes, not the silent street kind, but dramatic performers who acted out, let's call them suggestively mythological scenes. Guests were encouraged to drink mixed wine, a safer, more manageable version than the throat-searing treacle of undiluted varietals. They played drinking games like Kottabos, in which wine dregs were flung at targets, preferably while quoting poetry or making scandalous wagers. Some winners earned garlands. Others won the attention of someone across the mosaic floor, and that's when things could take a sharp turn toward the festive. Among the upper classes, it wasn't necessarily taboo for lovers, companions, or hired entertainers to join in the merriment, with a little more than small talk. Gossip strangled letters from the likes of Tacitus or Suetonius hint at whole-class carousing. The Emperor Nero, for example, was accused of hosting dinner parties that looked less like political banquets and more like a Dionysian audition. Though, in fairness, it may have simply been a well-lit toga malfunction. But even at milder soirees, the postprandial hours were flexible, even fluid. One moment, a Stoic senator might be quoting Socrates on virtue. The next, plucking grapes from the navel of someone who was definitely not his wife. It wasn't hypocrisy, it was Roman compartmentalization. Morals between noon and dinner, mischief after dessert. Of course, not every gathering turned into a tabloid scroll. Many ended quietly, with sleepy philosophers snoring into their tunics or slaves dutifully scraping wax drips from the statues. But those more animated parties, they became the stuff of whispered legend. Still, it's worth noting, among the chaos and carnivalesque mischief, there was a structure to it all. Certain roles were expected, certain behaviors frowned upon. What looked like lawless revelry to outsiders was often tightly choreographed, like a Bacchic ballet with very poor lighting. And behind it all was the gentle knock of morning, reminding everyone that even emperors and entertainers needed sleep, and perhaps a bath. As the final candle guttered in the triclinium and the echoes of laughter faded into the peristyle, Sextus would sink sideways onto his cushion, head full of half-remembered poetry and completely forgotten restraint. And somewhere, in the calm before sunrise, the whispers of the feast still hung in the scent of crushed rosemary and old wine. Tomorrow, however, brought new routines, and for some, a chance to dust off old togas and even older regrets. But before those roosters begin their imperious crowing, let us gently follow a silver-haired senator who's just slipped into the courtyard garden, drawn by the sound of water and the promise of solitary reflection. By now, our guest seat at the Roman convivium, the leisurely, hours-long feast, was nicely warmed. Figuratively, of course, unless your host had eccentric preferences in underfloor heating. As we settle further into the scented twilight of another banquet, dimly lit by flickering oil lamps and drowsing incense burners, the tempo had changed. Earlier hours had been devoted to food, philosophical banter, and decoding which patrician's toga was actually wool and which was just an expensive lie. But now we tiptoe into what the Romans called the commissatio, the wine-soaked, socially suspicious second act. It is here, in this cozy chaos, that the Roman toastmaster, a role humorously larger than it had any right to be, rose with exaggerated solemnity, presented a cup, and barked out the number of rounds of wine to be consumed. It was, in short, an official drinking pace setter. The title of arbiter bibendi, arbiter of drinking, may sound legal and impressive, but it mostly involved being imperiously tipsy and pretending to measure things. What shall it be? 3 cups for the 3 graces, 9 for the muses, or 12, like Hercules and his labours, they'd declare, balancing satire with slurred authority. Pliny the Elder suggested that wine should never exceed moderation, but Pliny the Younger, if you read between his lines, probably forgot moderation in his laundry once and never found it again. Wine at these affairs wasn't just wine. It was art. It was politics. It was suspiciously purple, often diluted by water, sometimes with spices, herbs, honey, or even seawater, because nothing says refined palate like briny Cabernet with a splash of seaworthy despair. The Romans believed in balance, though it's unclear whether they meant balancing flavors or balancing one's reclining posture without sliding under the table. Now, contrary to Hollywood's feelings, bacchanalian blowouts weren't an hourly occurrence. Not every night turned into a Dionysian frenzy with flute girls swinging from ceiling beams. Many feasts followed etiquette, measured steps between courses, talk, drink, and moralizing. Though the exact percentage of moralizing that involved hypocritical winks is difficult to determine. Still, some hosts did aim for spectacular decadence. Petronius, Rome's most stylish literary mischief maker, gives us the gleefully chaotic dinner of Trimalchio, a freedman who threw a banquet so stuffed with performance, gold-leaf dishes, and accidental burials, it could have been a modern reality show with Latin subtitles. At one point, dishes shaped like the zodiac signs appear, along with miniature pigs and flaming peacocks, which frankly deserves a culinary history award and a hotline to the fire brigade. In these twilight hours of the feast, performances meandered into view. Acrobats twirled between goblets. Harpists plucked moody chords. Poets, paid, pitied, or kidnapped, recited verses about virtue, while guests plotted virtues of a very different kind. One man might loudly debate Stoic philosophy while sipping infused wine from a woman-shaped goblet. Another might slip away with a flute girl only to return, disheveled, citing participation in a private symposium. And there, among the silken cushions and soft scandals, the voice of Venus began whispering, gently, provocatively, like a ticklish breeze snaking through the stone columns. Roman society was surprisingly fluid with certain affections. While strict laws tried to maintain appearances, especially among the upper classes, the feast floor could resemble a chessboard of smouldering glances and intricate flirtations. Men might flirt with slaves of either sex. Women, watching with fans fluttering at just the right pace, might have their own arrangements stitched into the folds of their stola. Of course, respectability was key. So long as no one was publicly shamed or caught touching a senator's heir without a palace permit, you were probably fine. Still, things could veer toward the deeply risque. There were feasts that eclipsed the boundary of polite decadence, like a chariot crashing through a grapevine trellis. Tiberius, the famously reclusive and oddly aquatic emperor, reportedly kept a caste of youthful swimmers trained in rather peculiar underwater skills. Caligula, not to be outdone, turned the imperial palace into a kind of intermittent pleasure barge. Though how much of this is biography versus gossip embroidered by scandal-hungry historians, well, that will always remain Rome's favorite blurred line. As the night air grows heavier with myrrh and someone's bad flute improvisation, we feel the mood go syrupy. Laughter slows to a whine sigh. Someone attempts to quote Virgil and forgets halfway through. A sandal is missing, and one poor philosopher has mistaken the vomitorium for an epistemological metaphor and now seeks meaning at the bottom of a mosaic basin. Just as the last cup is passed, and the wax of the final lamp drips its sleepy secrets, the feast edges toward that peculiar Roman quiet, delicately perfumed, deliciously complicated, and softly scandalous. And just beyond that hush, as dawn's toga brushes the sky, waits another layer of the Roman feast's sacred and sometimes absurd rituals. As the torches flickered low and the shadows of reclining guests danced across marble walls, let us now turn our sleepy gaze to one of the lesser discussed talents of ancient Rome, the art of vomit finesse. Yes, my drowsy listener, bucolic countryside estates and moonlit orgies may steal the headlines, but a Roman banquet wasn't truly roaring until someone had regurgitated their dormice-stuffed peacock. Strategically, of course. To the untrained eye, it might have resembled chaos after too much Falernian wine, someone excusing themselves with pale lips and purpose. But no, this was all part of the engineering. You see, Romans truly hated waste, of appetite, and thus was born the vomitorium. Now, despite how it sounds, a vomitorium was not a designated spew room at elite dinner parties. It was, in fact, an architectural term for the passageways in amphitheatres that allowed crowds to spew forth efficiently. But worry not, for Roman diners did not let the absence of purpose-built facilities stop them. Elite guests at feasts knew their capacities like seasoned champions. Atop dainty couches piled with embroidered cushions, they reclined in their finest togas, feigned laughter spilling as easily as the wine, as they carefully paced their gluttony. After the fifth course, a short stroll to the courtyard might provide a discreet moment of digestive reboot, then back for boiled ostrich and honeyed dormice. Waste not, want not. Of course, the Romans didn't consider this shameful. Quite the opposite. A host whose feast prompted bouts of joyful overindulgence displayed his power, his generosity, and his imported sea urchins. And as for the guest, to partake with gusto, until one could partake no more, was a sign of respect. An empty stomach was almost rude, like showing up to a toga party in common linen. Amid all this decadent digestion, the entertainment carried on, oblivious, or perhaps politely winking at, the ongoing gastric drama. Jugglers, musicians, and acrobats performed in the background, careful not to disturb anyone's delicate repose, or dry clean only togas. Speaking of togas, let us admit something. They may have looked stately in marble statues and school textbooks, but in a dinner party setting, they were about as practical as wearing your bedsheet to a 6-hour meal while lying on one elbow. They required careful draping and occasional readjustment by discreet slaves, lest too much leg be revealed or a wine stain sully one's toga praetexta. And what of the party games? For inebriation always seeks mischief. One such game was arbiter bibendi, meaning judge of drinking, a title appointed to one lucky soul whose power was as intoxicating as the wine they regulated. This person, often chosen by dice or whim, determined how much everyone had to drink and in what fashion, be it sips, gulps, or volcanic torrents. Imagine, if you will, being commanded to recite Homer backwards in between gulps of spiced wine while your neighbor attempted to balance a fig on her forehead. The Romans did not do subtle amusement. Every moment was theatre, even the slurred ones. Sometimes, mid-banquet, a philosophical toast would arise from the reclining ranks. "Let us drink," one would declare, "for life is short, and tomorrow we may wake up as ghouls." Everyone would laugh, except the ghoul at the end of the table. He didn't get the joke, probably because he thought they were being sincere. Perhaps one of the most curious aspects of these bacchanalian routines was the conviction that the feasting wasn't really about food at all. Food was simply the overture. The real aria, as the poets might say while attempting to charm someone's spouse, was the connection, status dances, sensual murmurings, exchange of poems or glances or both. And so, while the wine gave courage and the oysters gave, well, something else, the banquet floated gradually from indulgence into intimacy. Curtains of perfume clouded sharp memories. Musicians slowed their pace, and softer games were played in corners not lit by torchlight. But before we drift toward those steamier shadows, the ones that whisper rather than boast, let's first consider the curious etiquette of Roman hand gestures, for they weren't always meant for conversation. But that's a tale for quieter breaths and silkier visions. It's late. The oil lamps flicker, casting amber halos across the mosaicked floor, as if the gods themselves were dozing and left their divine flashlights half on. Beneath a painted ceiling of flying cupids and leafy vines, the Roman triclinium, or dining room, hums with a quiet post-banquet buzz. Not loud anymore. That roaring part is over. Now, it's the dreamy stretch, somewhere between the 10th course of peacock brains and the slow gravitational pull of sleep, or someone else's lap. By now, the wine has flowed like a minor flooding of the Tiber, and our noble Roman partygoers are existing in that blissful bubble where time is syrup slow, and inhibitions are stored away like dusty scrolls in the Forum Library. This chapter takes place in that golden hour of indulgence. Not quite orgy, but we're definitely warming up. See, in the Roman evening rhythm, this part of the convivium, the feast, is what they called the commissatio, the old-school version of a post-dinner wine club, but with more poetry and unpredictable nudity. It was a ritual unto itself. Think party games, ancient stand-up comedy, and reciting increasingly questionable verses of Catullus while trying not to spill your goblet. For hosting patrons, the commissatio was also a stage of great tactical finesse. Do you keep the senator from Beneventum entertained with a Lydian lyre? Has the Greek flute player been circulated too many times? Is that poet still insisting on performing his 237-line metaphor about Venus and a poorly made soup? Guests, mind you, were expected to participate, or at least pretend to. There was even a kind of wine referee known as the arbiter bibendi, literally the master of drinking. Elected by lot or popularity, or the sheer confidence of a man already halfway to tipsy, it was his solemn duty to determine the evening's wine-water ratio and to say ridiculous things like, "Tonight, we go 9 parts wine, 1 part water, for Bacchus commands it." In practice, this meant a very blurry tomorrow. But before you picture ancient frat parties in togas, remember, the Romans loved rules. Even their debauchery had structure. There were drinking songs with call and response choruses, Latin limericks with precisely timed punchlines, and toasts to everything from victory in Gaul to the host's unusually well-trained peacocks. Now, within the warmth of this candlelit swirl, the sensual slowly evolved into, well, the more sensual. Roman feast didn't necessarily begin as orgies, unless you showed up at Caligula's house. Most evenings unfolded more organically, like a fig ripening on the vine, or a toga dropping gently to the floor. Privacy, of course, was optional. The triclinium was a performance space as much as a dining room. Pleasure wasn't whispered about. It was woven into the evening's fabric. That woman laughing too loudly near the fountain. She may not be laughing at a joke. That young man stepping behind the curtain with a statesman twice his age could be debating Cicero, could also be demonstrating flexibility learned from gymnasium wrestling. Even within all this decadence, status reigned supreme. High-born Roman matrons often watched the party's later developments with an air of theatrical detachment, like elegant owls on expensive furniture. Invited courtesans, dancers, and entertainers were not only expected, but demanded, and some had reputations that outshone senators. One infamous flute player, Bathyllus, was so seductive in his routines that poets composed verses describing fainting spells and overheated spectators. A clarinet solo has never been so dangerous, yet beneath all the dazzle and deviance was a real rhythm, a softer current of intimacy and connection, however fleeting. In the cozy corner of the couch, two former rivals might find themselves reaching for the same honeyed date. Across the way, a widow known for politics and grief might lock eyes with a travelling Macedonian in scandalously short tunic. In vino veritas, they'd say. In wine, truth. But also, in wine, memories are stitched, good or indecent, depending on your Senate seat. As the embers from the brazier crackled at the heart of the room and guests sank deeper into silken cushions, the night took on a hazy, golden softness, the kind of moment when time forgets to keep track. This wasn't just a party. It was a ritual of escape, a shared dance of wine, winks, and whispered invitations. And as the hours grew heavier and the company more entwined, the sounds of laughter gave way to sighs, the air thick with perfume and Prosecco-strong Falernian wine. Sleep curled around the tiled columns like ivy. We'll leave the rest of the festivities for another moonlit hush, as velvet night settles quietly around the flickering flames, and something altogether more mysterious begins to unfold. Much like a Roman fresco, faded by time and candle soot, the exact line between dinner conversation and Dionysian excess at ancient Roman feasts is pleasantly blurry, and often wine-stained. By the time the second course had settled and the entertainment had begun, things drifted into a zone the Romans affectionately called commissatio, which roughly translates to, let's see how weird this can get before someone insults a senator. As the oil lamps flickered in amphora-shaped sconces, the air thickened with burnt myrrh, gossip, and the unmistakable tension of a party entering its experimental phase. The toga, that solemn drapery of Roman civic pride, loosened with each tumbling goblet of Falernian wine. In most polite households, this meant lounging a bit more sideways and giggling at increasingly scandalous poetry. In select corners of higher society, however, merriment took a more naked direction, literally and socially. Yes, the Romans loved their games, and after dinner, those games grew considerably less PG. But before you imagine a sprawling orgy on marble floors, thank you Hollywood, let's pause for an oat biscuit of historical accuracy. These parties weren't nightly pagan bacchanals. They were more like a combination of elite networking events, improv theatre, and way too much wine, with the occasional erotic subplot. Important to note, many Romans had what one might call a complicated relationship with morality. Publicly, they adored virtue and discipline. Privately, that discipline was occasionally blindfolded and tied to a couch. The concept of libertas, Roman freedom, was flexible depending on who was pouring the drinks and who was doing the interpreting. And from what we can gather, Interpretation involved a lot of sultry harp music. Slaves, as always, were an unfortunate and essential part of these affairs, often tasked with serving wine, reciting poetry, or performing acrobatics in what we might mildly describe as inventive clothing. Some were employed for their storytelling prowess, spinning tales of Odysseus or Jupiter, as guests nibbled honey-roasted dormice. Others were employed for, well, quite different storytelling techniques requiring far less dialogue. Still, not everything was sensual spectacle. Much of it was ritualized mischief, the deliberate undoing of daytime decorum. Picture a Roman senator, stolid and Roman-nosed by daylight, now attempting to balance a fig on the tip of his nose while serenading a peacock. Not metaphorically, a literal peacock. These birds were the status symbols of the elite, possibly because they were expensive, possibly because they were surprisingly judgmental looking when tipsy men recited Cato the Elder in their presence. Wine, as the great dissolver of class distinctions and personal boundaries, was poured without mercy. It was typically mixed with water, as drinking it neat was considered barbaric, but mix it they did, liberally, thoughtfully, and then less thoughtfully as the evening progressed. Drinking games were common. A popular one involved flicking pellets of bread at targets, or trying to pronounce Greek philosophical terms after 3 cups of sweetened posca. Spoiler: Socratic reason does not pair well with a buzzing inner ear and honeyed vinegar. Music rose and tumbled through these banquets like a tipsy river. Lyres, flutes, and tambourines tickled the background, while hired performers sang saucy lyrics about unfaithful gods and naughty nymphs. Occasionally, guests composed impromptu verse, most of it terrible, all of it applauded anyway, because wine is the great equalizer and the ultimate talent scout. And if the party was particularly indulgent, say, hosted by an emperor with more sandals than sense, then perhaps a room within the villa was dedicated to more tactile interpretations of companionship. These spaces weren't always orgiastic debauchery. Sometimes they featured gentle music, soft lighting, and philosophical discussions about pleasure. Other times, yes, rugs were involved, the kind you don't want to unroll without gloves and a little Lysol. Still, amid the flushed cheeks, perfumed bodies, and lyrical whispers, one thing remained constant: the desire not for chaos, but for temporary surrender. These feasts, for all their dramatics and drudgery, were fundamentally about escape from politics, from expectations, and from the haunting knowledge that one day even the most lavish dining couch becomes just a dusty ruin. But before the sun rises and the philosophers resume their robes, there's still more to savor in the glow of the Roman night, particularly as the cupbearers refill and the laughter deepens, rich as a vintage aged beneath the hills of Campania. Now, if you've ever wondered what sort of games aristocrats get up to after downing several cups of watered wine in a candlelit atrium, the answer is both less and more ridiculous than you'd think, because once the formalities waned and the servant boys had filled the final goblets, Roman dinner parties drifted inevitably toward a peculiar blend of slurred debate, intimate confessions, rickety stabs at poetry, and sometimes something resembling a talent show. You see, the convivium, that's Latin for a proper Roman feast, didn't just end with dessert. Oh no, that's when the commissatio, or the after-party of the after-party, would begin. This was the moment when togas were tugged askew, morals slipped slightly downward, and the evening evolved into what one might euphemistically call an emotional symposium. Picture it. long couches of overfed men reclining at impossible angles, their sandals tossed aside like regrets, while musicians plucked away at noisy string instruments and dancers twisted into interpretive poses with equal parts grace and disorientation. The host might spontaneously compose an ode to Jupiter, or more likely, Jupiter's thighs. Toasts would be made to love, beauty, philosophy, and, bafflingly, well-fortified aqueducts. And that was just the first hour. But let us drift, like grape leaves in a neglected wine jug, to one of the more talked-about customs of these events: libation and flirtation games. Among the more lively diversions was a playfully scandalous pastime known as symposium koina, which roughly translates to communal things at a drinking party. It was essentially truth or dare with higher stakes, because the Roman elite had a flair for combining existential philosophy with mild intoxication and thinly veiled innuendo. They might play par impar, a guessing game involving fingers held under the table. Or they'd try their hand, quite literally, at oscillum, where masks of gods would be swung like pendulums and guests would have to kiss whoever it landed nearest. Imagine musical chairs, but the music never stops, and everyone is preoccupied making eye contact with mixed intentions. By this point in the evening, the slaves carrying the wine ladles looked increasingly bewildered. Meanwhile, poets and philosophers found themselves trapped in debates about whether late-night lusting was more virtuous if compared to the movements of the planets. I mean, if one could justify making eyes at your neighbor's spouse on the grounds of Saturn being in retrograde, the Roman aristocracy would give it a ceremonial olive branch. And just because we're in ancient Rome doesn't mean we're without poetry. In fact, things only got more sonnet-heavy as the night wore on. Ovid himself might have composed a few cheeky verses mid-banquet, assuming he wasn't too distracted by the acrobat trying to balance an amphora on her head while reciting Virgil backward. Yes, even humour had its role in these gatherings. Dry jokes layered with wordplay that only tenured senators and overfed philosophers could appreciate to their fullest. For instance, to call someone more full of wine than a back-kick ceremony was both an insult and a compliment, depending on whether the person was still upright. But not all Roman revelry was as scandalous as later Renaissance painters made it out to be. Many Roman feasts ended not with orgies, but with snoring. Guests would doze mid-recline, their tunics rumpled, the torchlight flickering over piles of forgotten grapes, and a half-scribbled poem dedicated to someone named Livia with a cloud-soft voice. The sensuality of the evening, it turned out, often gave way to the soporific slow fade of full bellies and furnace-warm bathhouses. There's something oddly comforting about that, isn't there? The idea that even the most decadent of Rome's night owls eventually had to loosen their sandal straps, find a pillow, and snore themselves hoarse. And as the moon drifted lazily over terracotta roofs, as laughter slipped into yawns and torchlight blurred into dreams, one could glimpse the very human heartbeat beneath Rome's marble mask. A people simultaneously craving glory, wisdom, mischief, and perhaps just a good night's sleep after too much Falernian wine. Softly now, let us step out of the atrium's hush and into the quieter corridors of Roman pastimes, because while feasts filled the night, the games they played after, well, those had a rhythm all their own. By this point, in a Roman feast, sometime around the third round of wine, and at least 2 rounds past decorum, things began to blur a little, in history and in eyesight. The couches had grown more horizontal than upright, Sandals had long since been flicked aside in favor of bare, grape-stained toes, and someone's tunic was now being worn as a makeshift headband. It was the moment of the convivium when Saturn himself might have looked down, shook his celestial head and muttered, "These mortals really let themselves go." But this was part of the plan, or at least what passed for a plan in Roman merrymaking philosophy. They had a word for this fading of the self into the wine cup: relaxatio. Not quite the same as our modern spa sense of relaxation, but more akin to a permission slip to dissolve one's dignity like honey into hot balsam. At this sacred hour, let's generously call it the 9th or maybe 10th hour of the Roman day, entertainers were summoned not just to delight, but to distract. Dancers, acrobats, and actors in masked mime performances fluttered into the space like exotic birds, their presence as much auditory chaos as visual spectacle. Picture a half-drunken senator clapping off rhythm as a flute player attempts a solo, while a monkey in miniature laurels rides by on a pig. And yes, that absolutely could and did happen. Now, beneath the curls of incense and rising laughter, there were certain games Romans particularly favoured during this phase of the feast. One of the more tantalising was called par impar. Essentially, ancient Roman odds or evens, played with hidden fingers and consequences involving kisses, forfeits, and the occasional deliberate wardrobe malfunction. Think truth or dare, but in Latin and sponsored by way too much Falernian wine. Then there was Latrunculi, a sort of proto-chess for the buzzed patrician brain, beloved by those who fancied themselves strategic thinkers even after their 4th cup. And inevitably, there was poetry. Wonderful, slurred, wildly inappropriate poetry, often improvised on the spot, and often involving metaphors about figs that should never be repeated in polite society, or anywhere really. And amidst all this, somewhere between the poetry recitations and someone reenacting a scene from the Aeneid, using only grapes and hand gestures, came the symposium's more intimate intermissions. You see, while Roman ideals often preached the virtues of restraint and self-control, feast culture functioned more like a backstage pass to the Aeneid. The after-dinner scenes were not unlike a dream: curtains drawn, lamps dimmed, pillows fluffed like small cumulus, clouds of linen and goose down. It wasn't exactly orgiastic chaos, at least not always, but it wasn't a sewing circle either. Historical sources, like the ever-suspicious Suetonius and the perpetually scandalized Seneca, describe such gatherings with varying degrees of horror and glee, but, like all good gossip, take it with a pinch of salt, preferably from the rim of a well-poured wine cup. Yes, love affairs bloomed over figs and flutes. Romances began and ended before the dessert course. Mistresses and lovers passed like side dishes along the triclinium couches. It all felt timeless and strange, like the dim echo of a dream where few rules applied, except perhaps the unspoken one that what happened at the convivium often stayed at the convivium, unless your name was Nero, in which case it probably became a chapter in a heavily footnoted history scroll. Interestingly, censors, the somewhat joyless morality police of Roman society, occasionally tried to rein in these excessive feasts, issuing stern decrees and grumpy frowns, reminding Romans that such indulgence was unbecoming of a proper citizen. The Romans, of course, responded by simply eating earlier, drinking faster, and relocating certain portions of their evening to more dimly lit, less censorable venues. Pragmatism, thy name was Publius. In truth, these evenings weren't just hedonistic escapes, they were pressure valves. In a city teeming with ceremony, ranks, politics, conquests, and concrete aqueducts, there had to be a space for chaos, for what historian Mary Beard might call institutionalized silliness. After all, no empire lasts on bread and discipline alone. It needs occasional cheese and laughter too. The lamps flickered lower now, as the evening stretched toward the borderlands of night. In the velvet hush between songs, a toast is whispered to Bacchus, god of wine, ritual madness, and probably the original inventor of the hangover. And as the laughter settles, pillows shift, and dreams begin to drift in like fog around a candle. We'll leave the triclinium for now, but gently, so as not to step on a lute or a senator who's fallen asleep under the table. Soon, we'll need to visit what the next morning looked like, when the sun rose over the ruins of revelry, and Roman hangover remedies were every bit as theatrical as their feasts. Now, as the sun slinked back behind olive groves and terracotta roofs, and the final goblets of Falernian wine were being topped off under the purpling Roman sky, we find ourselves nestled within the quieter shadows of banquet halls, the softer corners, if you will, of Rome's famed feasting culture. The part that came after the peacock tongue pies, but before the more, shall we say, philosophical nudity. Because once the bellies were full and the jokes about senators grew just a touch too bawdy for polite conquest planning, it was time for the next act of the convivium. The symposium. No, not the Socratic dialogue version necessarily, but rather the Roman remix, less Plato, more Plonk. At Roman feasts, there was often a marked transition from dinner, cena, to the after-dinner entertainment, commissario. This shift involved more than an increase in wine flow. It was a subtle recategorization of intention. Where cena might feature philosophy, poetics, or pretending not to notice how much your neighbor smelled like garlic, commissario was the moment when the wine took the wheel, and with wine came a curious little character called the arbiter bibendi, quite literally, the judge of drinking. Trophy title, isn't it? Their job was to determine the mixture of wine to water, because no one drank the stuff unmixed, not even in their most toga-tangled shenanigans. The brave arbiter would declare whether the wine would be diluted 3 parts water to 1 part wine. Or, if the night was leaning toward mayhem, maybe the reverse. Naturally, some took the role very seriously. Pliny the Elder writes of one aristocratic gentleman who insisted that precision in pouring is the root of social order. Somewhere out there, a Roman Karen was policing the Cabernet with a measuring spoon and a sense of civic duty. With the concoction approved, drinking games began. Games with names as charmingly absurd as their mechanics. There was kotobos, a leftover from the Greeks, involving flicking dregs of wine from your cup at a target. Points for style, likely deducted if you clocked a senator square in the bald spot. Then there was a iactatio poculi, or the dramatic tossing of the goblet, which was less of a game and more of an expressive way to demand a refill. As the air got warmer and the candles burned lower, the entertainment began to slink in. Equal parts improvised theatre, cheeky poetry, and the occasional hired flute girl, who may or may not double as a philosophy enthusiast, depending on the fee. It was in these candlelit hours, under columns whispering with ivy, that Roman feasts shed their civic pretenses and became more intimate affairs. Now, let's not overstate the wildness of it all. Not every Roman dinner devolved into orgiastic chaos. Many nights passed uneventfully, with more snoring than seduction. But then, there were those times. Oh, history doesn't forget the peculiar. Elagabalus, for example, the teenage emperor, with a flair for the absurd, is said to have hosted dinner parties where roses rained from the ceiling, so many in fact that some guests allegedly suffocated. A risky brand of flower power, truly. He also served courses backwards and invited guests solely for the pleasure of watching them eat from gold, while slaves dined beside them in silver, just to spark awkward dinner conversation. Icebreaker or eyesore? That's for historians to debate. And let's not forget the curious tradition of aperitio, the after-dinner unveiling. Guests might be led, game show style, into an adjoining chamber where luxurious couches and even more exotic amusements awaited. Think less Netflix and more uncomfortably long odes to Venus, sometimes accompanied by live performances that we shall gently describe as interpretive. Of course, the Romans had complex boundaries. Adultery could be punishable, while other acts, more theatrical in nature, were oddly permissible so long as they folded within the choreography of elite behavior. The distinction between acceptable indulgence and societal scandal was delicate, a finely perfumed line between whispered praise and public disgrace. As with all things in Roman life, the drinking and dalliances weren't just about pleasure. They were performances of power, invitations for alliances, tests of loyalty, whispered confessions and winking promises. A spilled drink could start a friendship or a civil war. One never knew. And yet, as another cracked amphora was swept away and the whispers faded into snores and scattered sandals, the villa slowly exhaled. Another evening had passed, rich with laughter, lust, and questionable table napkin poetry. Now, let's dim the oil lamps and slip our feet from those heavy sandals, my dear listener. There's more to discover beyond the colonnades, more secrets in the shadows of marble and mulled wine. The night is still young in the empire that never stopped to sleep. So why should we? As the oil lamps flickered low and the wine-stained goblets grew heavy in hand, there came a moment in every proper Roman convivium when conversation took a sudden philosophical turn. Or at least, it tried to. It was a curious transformation. One moment, you're laughing at Gaius attempting to wear a grapevine crown that keeps falling into his lentils. And the next, someone is quoting Lucretius with red teeth and slippery syntax. This was the hour when toga-clad citizens, bowed with booziness and bloated with garum-laced delicacies, turned from revelry to reverie, or the clumsy approximation of it. The Romans, in their fashionably chaotic way, believed that true pleasure involved not just the consumption of fermented grape juice and stuffed dormice, but also spirited debates about love, virtue, the soul, and whether Cicero had a punchable face. Spoiler, many thought so. And so, after the peacock had been picked clean and the dancers had either twirled themselves into naps or the arms of helpful senators, the dining room, once a riot of feathers and lyre music, became a sort of dreamy salon under the stars. Reclining on their sides, propped like floppy philosophers on embroidered cushions, Romans engaged in what they called symposia philosophiae, informal, wine-fueled philosophical discussions, which had the consistency of cheesecake and the logic of a hedgehog on a spinning stool. Remarkably, even the drunkest patrician could summon lofty ideas with the grace of a stumbling oracle. What is virtue? Lucius might ask, gesturing with a fig, which promptly flies into someone's goblet. Is it in action or intent? Virtue, Marcus replies, picking olive pits from his tunic sleeve, is not skipping dessert, even when you know you should. Philosophers take note, for the well-read, channeling their inner Plato, was part of the evening's charm. For others, It was an opportunity to dramatically misquote Stoics and get away with it. Seneca's musings on temperance, for instance, were often cited mid-belch, and Epicurus, who preached simplicity, was inexplicably invoked while reaching for a golden honey cake molded in the shape of a temple. Now, lest you think only men participated in these debates, we must step lightly into the candlelit crannies of Roman dining etiquette. While traditional Roman feasts were male-dominated, women, particularly in more liberal upper-class circles, did join in, lounge-legged and sharp-tongued. Elite Roman women were no shy violets. Many were educated, multilingual, and well-versed in rhetoric. A witty retort about Platonic ideals from a senator's wife was not only admired, it was feared, especially when said with one eyebrow raised and a wine jug in hand. Slaves, of course, orbited quietly through these intellectual interludes, topping up cups and removing the occasional guest who philosophized a bit too hard and succumbed to sleep atop the roast. These moments were as rehearsed as they were revered, a performance of civility amidst chaos, reason woven into revelry like gold thread in a toga hem. But not all attendees embraced the cerebral shift. Some tried gamely, squinting into their cups, as if wisdom were hiding at the bottom with the dregs. Others slurred their way through half-remembered tales of Cato the Elder, only to trail off into gentle snoring, their heads pillowed on garlands they'd already forgotten they'd worn. The best thinkers knew the hazy border where contemplation met comfort. They floated in that liminal space between quote and nap, where Zeno's paradoxes met the slow rhythm of a sated heartbeat. Sleep crept into the triclinium like a welcome guest, draping itself over shoulders and thoughts like a warm woolen palla. And in that drowsy hour, as the moonlight tucked itself between marble columns and the last honey-sweet notes of the panpipes faded into velvet air, Rome whispered softly to itself, a lullaby of minds both great and hilariously jumbled. After all, what could be more Roman than trying to define the cosmos while reclining, drunk, and full of hedgehog-shaped pastries? Let us now leave them, mid-thought and mid-snooze, their dreams swirling with Socratic debates, prophetic burps, and maybe just the glint of leftover peacock feathers. Ahead lies a tale not of thoughts, but of what came after the final toast, when the lights dimmed, the frescoes watched in silence, and stolen moments flickered to life under the moon's amused gaze. Somewhere between the 6th and 7th goblet of wine, because the Romans, in their infinite wisdom, had more types of wine vessels than we have types of kombucha. A curious transformation would begin to stir amongst the reclining guests at a Roman feast. Statuesque as they tried to be at the beginning of the evening, the togas had started to slouch. Someone had definitely started quoting Plato entirely out of context, and the musicians had long since pivoted from soft lyre strumming to something alarmingly rhythmic involving cymbals, flutes, and mood lighting courtesy of ever-flickering oil lamps. Welcome, then, to the libation stretch of the convivium. That's Roman for banquet, though controlled chaos with decorative cushions might have been more accurate towards the later hours. Around this time, the symposium-inspired intentions of the evening, intelligent conversation, poetic recitations, perhaps a saucy nod towards Stoic philosophy, tended to dissolve into an atmosphere best described as social experimentation on grape juice. Let's talk about the drinking itself. Roman wine was not the fruity, dry companion your modern dinner table knows. Oh no. Roman wine was thick, syrupy and furious, like it was made by someone who thought fermented raisins were an appropriate base beverage. So they watered it down, always, Drinking it straight was seen as barbaric behavior reserved for Scythians, madmen, or senators with career-ending confidence issues. The host, carefully perched at the uppermost triclinium cushion like a cat on a director's chair, had full control over the dilution ratio. 6 parts water to 1 wine. That's a philosophical evening. 1 to 1? That's a Dionysian free-for-all. No water at all. Cancel tomorrow's Senate meeting. And of course, with enough wine poured and the right people reclining elbow to elbow, certain after-dinner amusements began to bloom like scandalous little peonies. The ancient Roman feast was not merely about nourishment or even pleasure. It was theatre, or perhaps more accurately, vaudeville with very few inhibitions and a surprising number of fruit trays. Professional entertainers would arrive, now announcing themselves with the nonchalance of performers who'd seen it all. Dancers spun in stylized, suggestive movements. Acrobats balanced themselves on amphorae, which seems inadvisable, especially if they were full. And jugglers tossed everything from flaming torches to peeled peaches, often with variable success. It wasn't uncommon for the theme of the evening to suddenly pivot. A feast that began in honor of, say, a birthday or a senator's third acquittal might seamlessly evolve into a celebration of Bacchus, god of wine, frenzy, and regrettable tattoos. At this stage, guests might replace conversational Latin with softly mumbled spells, because why not invoke some minor household deities when you've had 9 scoops of fish sauce pudding? Of creatures notably present at these gatherings, one must mention the cunning cupbearer. Usually a handsome youth or servant trained with precision worthy of an Olympic gymnast. This role was highly strategic. They poured, they spun, they whispered gossip, and sometimes they facilitated romantic interludes between guests who had made enough prolonged eye contact over olives to warrant divine intervention. Now, not everyone participated in the more exploratory parts of these gatherings. Many preferred to sip quietly and observe the shenanigans from the relative safety of their reclining cushion. For those, the feast was like nature documentary filmmaking. You don't interfere with the wild, spirited creatures across the triclinium. You simply record their mating rituals. Snakes appeared too, in stories at least, since Bacchic rites often included tales of serpents slithering round celebrants like accessories with eyes. Symbolism, ever theatrical, was rich as fig cake. Life, rebirth, chaos, possibly indigestion. There were even occasional games involving dice, drinking penalties, or reciting poetry with sandal in mouth, because nothing says cultural legacy like failing to rhyme in dactylic hexameter while chewing on leather footwear. Amidst all this, perhaps you'd spot a quiet nodder in the corner, an older guest, seasoned and wise, still clutching his now empty goblet with the kind of ancient satisfaction only afforded to those who know when to recline and when to retreat, because eventually, as with all things Roman, even the most opulent of festivities must give way to the blissful stillness of sleep and the delicate challenge of standing up without tripping over someone else's toga. And so, as the oil lamps flicker lower and the musicians swap their flutes for soft yawns, we begin drifting toward the quieter corridors of the Roman night, where the party lingers like incense and new tongues whisper of secrets still to come. As the candles flickered low around marble columns and the slow perfume of crushed rose petals mingled with too much wine and too little restraint, the Roman feast found itself meandering, not ending, not really, just slipping sideways into indulgence's peculiar second act, the drinking games. You see, by now, most togas were, to put it politely, relaxed, while the attire might have started evening length, somewhere between the 5th goblet and the grape shooting contest, fashion and formality were readily abandoned at the altar of Dionysian nonsense. Now, the ancients, ever dramatic and delightfully impractical, had a game called symposium. Not to be confused with our modern notion of a symposium, which involves keynote speeches and tepid coffee. The Roman version bore a closer resemblance to the Olympic Games. If those games had included riddles, wine, sexual innuendo, and the ability to throw things at amphorae while maintaining a dignified smirk. One popular challenge was kotabos. Imagine a kind of drunken discus event, except instead of discs, you're lobbing the dregs of your wine at a metal plate or a bowl balanced atop a stand. Points were theoretically awarded for aim, flair, or whether you managed to flirt provocatively mid-throw. Participants would lazily lounge, elbow propped on a silk-covered cushion, eyeing their targets like intoxicated falcons. And as they released the remnants of their wine in a languid arc, they'd often call out the name of a lover. If your wine hit its mark, it meant you had a shot with that person. If it missed, well, so much for passion. Your fates, like the wine, had splattered uselessly on the floor. Meanwhile, in quieter corners of the triclinium, someone was probably whispering half a line of Virgil to a fig merchant's niece while trying not to burp in hexameter. And somewhere, someone else, perhaps a previously dignified senator, was attempting to seduce an opera singer by reciting Plato. Incorrectly. But for all its theatrical chaos, there was a certain structure to the revelry, an etiquette to the inebriation. One simply did not become raucous too early. There was a build-up, like the slow crescendo in a very tipsy concerto. Lucullus, he of the infamous appetite, reportedly hosted feasts so lavish that guests were expected to discuss philosophy, politics, and certain subtleties of epic poetry between gulps of mulled wine and nibbles of honeyed dormice. But say, just say, you weren't interested in philosophical hullabaloo and preferred a bit more physical expression. Then you might wander into a motley side room, perhaps framed with velvet drapes and suggestive statuary. Here was the realm of dice games, flirtation, and other matters best left to imagination or poor choices. Roman dice were six-sided, not unlike our own, though occasionally loaded, both metaphorically and literally. Wagers were made, clothes were lost, acronyms were invented. Games like Alea, the Roman equivalent of "Oops, I gambled away my sandals again," turned many a noble-born into a noble debtor. One scribe even noted a man who bet his own villa in a drunken haze, won it back in the next round, and then lost again to a slave who turned out to be a free man, masquerading as a kitchen attendant with an uncanny talent for probability. And while the games rolled on, the wine kept flowing, driven by slaves who wore signs indicating whether they were pouring red, white, or wine cut with the herbs that might make you see Saturn doing the cha-cha. Occasionally, a bard or storyteller would rise to deliver an obscene version of a myth, maybe a version of Aphrodite's birth that involved more oysters than Olympus. Laughter would ripple over gold-leafed cups and through hallways scented with crushed thyme and citrus. But despite it all, the drinking bouts, the saucy dances, the erratic poetry slams, Romans rarely thought of these nights as debauchery. To them, it was simply the art of living lavishly, a dance with Bacchus under the watchful eye of Venus, with Mars popping in occasionally to lose at dice and argue with a flute player. As the evening wound on, though time in such parties was more a suggestion than a measurement, guests began to drift, some to more private chambers, others to discussion groups attempting to recall the correct order of emperors after Augustus, and a few to the garden, slipping into moon-drenched silence that smelled faintly of spilled wine and ambition. Even rowdiest knights must find quiet, and even the loudest drunken philosophers eventually nod off mid-soliloquy. But what of the lounge? What of the pillowed semicircles and the glistening grapes left uneaten on silver trays? Ah, those, dear listener, were merely intermission, because next we turn not to the feasts themselves, but to their fallout, the gossip, the poetry, and the tabloid-style graffiti scrawled in the latrines of Pompeii. As the hour grew late in the villas of the Roman elite, when the burning torches cast long trembling shadows upon mosaics, glittering with tales of gods who just couldn't behave themselves, the banquet would begin to sag a bit, like a toga, after too much wine and an overly enthusiastic dance-off. This part of the evening, nestled deep in the post-gluttony phase, was known as commissatio, a word which roughly translates to the drinking contest your mother warned you about. Now, by this point, everyone was already horizontal, literally. Romans of a certain station didn't sit upright at dinner. That was for peasants and philosophers. No, at these elite feasts, guests reclined on cushioned couches, propped languidly on one arm like exhausted statues of virtue, which again, they were not. The food had come and gone in waves of stuffed dormice, fish sauce fountains, and cakes shaped like mythological creatures. The oil lamps flickered. The air smelled of roses, sweat, and slightly panicked liver function. Enter the arbiter bibendi, the delightfully unnecessary role of master of the drinks, a title so proudly ostentatious it might have had its own laurel wreath. This was the honoured guest chosen to set the pace of inebriation for the night. He, or in some fashionable cases she, would dictate how many parts wine to, how many parts water should be mixed in the communal crater. This crucial calculation could determine whether the evening ended in philosophical debate, interpretative Dionysian rope dancing, or an impromptu reenactment of the Battle of Cannae using only olives and sheer bravado. Roman wine was not, as modern palates might hope, a smooth Merlot. It was rough, raw, and so powerful even the gods might blink twice. To soften it, they diluted it generously. But at a raucous commissatio, the arbiter bibendi might slyly recommend a 1.1 mix. At that ratio, the conversation would drift from Cicero's oratory to how nice it is to be a cloud, and whether clouds have feelings, and if so, are they better at relationships than senators? Accompanying the drinking were games, ludus they called them, though historical sources might agree that these games were about as ludic as a peacock on a trampoline. One popular pastime was symposiastic riddling, where each guest had to deliver a brain teaser while slightly cross-eyed from spiced wine. Answer correctly, and you were given a grape to nibble. Get it wrong, and you were challenged to chug. Recite a poem badly, or, oddly often, remove an item of clothing. Ah yes, the nudity. It's time we waded, gracefully, into the warm, perfumed waters of Roman sensuality. Not every Roman feast descended into an orgiastic free-for-all, as popular Hollywood would like us to dream in grainy filters. Most were a mixture of polite affairs spiced up with a scandalous performance here, a seductive flute player there. But among the upper crust, and mostly behind closed marble doors, away from the judgment of grandmothers and Augustus himself, some feast did slip, slide, or sashay into intimate territory. There might be entertainers skilled in more than the lyre. Courtesans, male and female, flitted about like gossip in a forum. They circulated with jugs of wine, whispered suggestive Lucanian poetry into ears, and dramatically lost their balance onto the wrong lap. Whether this was deliberate or due to the richness of dessert is, as ever, historically inconclusive. Guests might slink off to alcoves draped with gauzy curtains, pretending to go look at the rare imported statues, only to emerge much later, hair tousled and expressions suspiciously serene. But it's worth noting that these behaviors, while legendary, weren't accepted by all. Stoics, ever the killjoys, railed against this decadence, claiming Rome would fall not to barbarians, but to the moral decay of wine-slicked couches and adventurous use of fig leaves. Still, the elite powered on. Privacy, power, and plenty made for a marble-edged playground where indulgence could frolic. These feasts were less about sustenance and more about status. Who you invited, how fine your goblets, how rare your oysters, how witty your scandal. These were the true courses of the meal. But even Bacchus, god of inebriation, must yawn eventually. As the firelight flickered low and one senator snored softly into a pile of embroidered cushions, the mood shifted again. The music slowed. The last of the honeyed wine was sipped. Someone recited a line of Virgil and then promptly sneezed, eliciting laughter halfway between polite and tipsy. And as dawn threatened the velvet sky, casting faint gold against the colonnades, the revelers began to quiet. The slaves cleared the dishes silently, the torches guttered out, and whispers of dreams mingled with hangovers not yet fully formed. But not all banquets were carved from marble and mystery. Some Roman feasts, dear listener, had a prickly surprise of their own. Because among the culinary curiosities of Rome, there was one ingredient so adored yet so baffling it deserves an after-dinner story all to itself. By the time the final goblets had been drained and the performers gently persuaded off the mosaic stage, the Roman feast had transformed from dinner party to phantasmagoria. And yet, among the silks and spilled wine, where bodies lay strewn like toga-clad sculptures in the afterglow of too much everything, there remained one last curious custom we mustn't ignore before the lamps dim completely. The ancient Roman hangover rituals. Yes, even in a society devoted to debauchery, there were morning-after remedies with just as much enthusiasm, and arguably even less good judgment. For the elite of Rome, waking up after a particularly spirited convivium, that's Latin for drunken dinner with entirely too much flute music, required more than just strong coffee, mostly because coffee hadn't made its delightful debut in Europe yet. Their go-to cures included such enticing options as fried canary, yes, a small bird, featherless, one would hope, given the culinary standards of imperial haute cuisine. Supposedly, devouring one upon sunrise might scare the hangover demons back into hiding. Another remedy mentioned by Pliny the Elder, who, bless his encyclopedic heart, made it his business to record human folly as often as natural wonders, involved mixing the ashes of a deer's antler into wine. The catch? You had to drink it the night before drinking began, a kind of preemptive strike. Now, whether this merely gave the brain another problem to fixate on besides wine-induced regret is uncertain. Less poetic but more widespread was the Roman affection for cabbage. Cato the Elder, ever the party pooper, swore up and down in his writings that eating cabbage before you drank would prevent both intoxication and a morning of remorse. Romans took that advice so seriously that cabbage was almost the unofficial mascot of moderation. A leafy green wet towel thrown upon the bonfire of Roman excess. But perhaps the most pivotal ritual of the Roman hangover wasn't physical at all. It was reputational. The morning after the feast, one had to reckon not only with a pounding head, but also the potential shame of having gotten just a bit too Dionysian the night before. For remember, even among their libertinism, Romans were ferociously status conscious. A senator who misjudged his ratio of Falernian wine to Lucanian sausage might find himself the subject of sharp whispers in the forum. "Did you see Gaius last night?" Sang with the flute girls, he did. Twice. And that sort of historical PR damage could be far more painful than any headache. So to mitigate this, Romans often employed what modern management consultants might call reputation pre-repair. Before leaving the feast, they would ensure a closing toast was raised, a particularly pithy philosophical musing dropped, perhaps a quote from Homer. Anything to suggest that their merriment had been touched by virtue, or at least verse. And if things truly did go awry, many turned to the gods of their livers, quite literally. Small offerings to Bacchus, Liber, or even Apollo were made the morning after, beseeching celestial forgiveness and no small amount of water. After all, who better to absolve a night of epic indulgence than the divine patrons of wine, freedom, and medicinal herbs? As the rooftops brightened and hangover hymns echoed softly through atriums, the Roman world carried on. Slaves cleared the empty amphorae, courtyards were doused in fresh water and cheap perfume, and yesterday's scandal became tomorrow's metaphor about balance and excess, often written in decorative mosaic over someone's bath. Because for all their abandon, the Romans remained creatures of ritual. Even their wildest nights folded into a deeper cultural rhythm, one that understood the dance of desire and discipline, of indulgence, followed by introspection. A rhythm not unlike the swaying step of a tipsy patrician trying to recall which sandal belonged on which foot, while quoting Plato to the household dog. So gently now, as the last candle guttered in a silver lotus-shaped sconce, and the wind whispered through olive branches stretched along the villa's colonnade, the night began to exhale. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster crowed, crowding that cacophony of philosopher hangovers and wine-splotched tunics. But the stories weren't quite done yet. There was still one final act before the night surrendered fully to the morning, a secret that lay not in the cup or in the kiss, but somewhere far deeper. Let's drift there together. The torches flicker low now. In the quiet corners of the triclinium, the last figs are left uneaten. The garum slicked plates are pushed aside, and the guests who once argued over philosophy and who had the best calves in the Senate are now drooping gently into post-feast drowsiness. Even the poets, those famously tireless night owls, have found themselves slurring their hexameters and using wine-soaked bread as makeshift bookmarks in scrolls they'll certainly forget by sunrise. As we settle into the final hush of the Roman convivium, that once raucous blend of banquet and bacchanal, it's worth lingering just a little longer on the softer curiosities, the often overlooked details that live between the sips of Falernian and stolen glances across the couch. For instance, did you know that in ancient Rome, it was considered extremely poor form to leave a dinner party without vomiting? Yes, pardon the imagery, but a host provided feathered tools, lovingly carved from ivory or silver, for this very purpose. Not because waste was elegant, Romans were obsessed with efficiency, but because someone had put so much time into that honey-roasted dormouse. Gluttony, believe it or not, was a form of gratitude. The more you ate, the more you adored your host's culinary piety. A good guest made room, and we haven't spoken much of the role of the cupbearer, a title far more sensual than it sounds. They were often beautiful young slaves or servants, highly trained in manners, poetry, and the art of refilling your goblet exactly 7 seconds before you thought to ask. Some Roman elites went so far as to train their cupbearers in philosophy, so they could engage in light stoic banter between rounds of mulled wine. Nothing says cultured debauchery like being corrected on Cicero mid-flirtation. But of course, not every element of these feasts was as glamorous as the silk-wrapped, saffron-scented myth might suggest. The seating arrangements, for example, were subtle indicators of one's political relevance. Being placed too close to the kitchen doors could signify social extinction. One's proximity to the host silently declared rankings. Your conversational brilliance might earn you an upgrade next time, just as that one ill-timed remark about someone's mother's virtue could leave you reclining beside the family dog. And not everything served was decadent. Romans, in their genius for contradiction, could mix the elaborate with the absurd. A dish might come adorned with peacock feathers soaked in wine reduction, only for its highlight to be a boiled beet. Exoticism mattered, even if your guest went home confused and mildly constipated. Some of these gatherings took odd turns as the night stretched on. Alcohol had its way of transforming orators into dancers and senators into something dangerously close to stand-up comics. At one now infamous gathering at Lucullus's estate, a drunken guest attempted to recite all of Virgil backwards while balanced on a dining couch. He did about 3 lines, fell off, and was so applauded that someone later wrote a poem about the endeavour. They titled it The Intellectual Descent. And then there were the after-feast entertainments, entwinings of music, whispered gossip, romantic tensions, and treacherous games of discretion. Someone always played the lyre a bit too earnestly. Someone always sang something unwise. The room dimmed further. Gauze curtains drifted like fog across the mosaic floors. With inhibitions stewed, some guests peeled off to quieter rooms, chasing warmth in the arms of whichever witty philosopher or charming flute player had caught their eye over olives and epigrams. Of course, it was said that what happened after the lamps were lowered belonged to the gods and the rumour mill in equal parts. Scribbled notes on papyrus the next morning, often in very bad verse, would attempt to capture fragments. Who touched whom? Who declared undying love? Who mistook the household statue of Minerva for a guest and tried to kiss it? It was all part of the experience. And yet, for all their decadence, Roman feasts were not merely exercises in excess. They were rituals disguised as revelry, a chance to discuss mortality between bites of honey cake, to practice civility in a world on the edge of chaos, to remember joy, even if overly salted, overly dramatized, and perhaps slightly fermented. And now, as the wine cools and our imaginations dim with the final glow of oil lamps, we leave the banquet behind. The murals on the walls fade into the shadows. The amphorae stand like quiet sentinels, and even the most verbose philosopher finally falls silent. Sleep, dear listener, as the feast slips gently into the mist of memory. Tomorrow's empire can wait. Tonight, you dine among the dreams.